Welcome to Reason and Theology, everyone. I'm your host, Michael Lofton, joined by esteemed guests, Dr. Jared Goff and Dr. David Bradshaw, returning guests, in fact. And by the way, I want to just welcome you both to the show. Thank you both for coming on. It's truly an honor.
Mm-hmm.
And
Thanks.
just by way,
Good to be here.
yes, excellent. And just by way of introduction, Dr. Jared Goff is an Eastern Catholic theologian of the Scotist tradition, and Dr. David Bradshaw is an Eastern Orthodox theologian of the Palamite tradition. And what we're doing today is discussing the essence and energies distinction in the Scotist tradition and also in the Palamite tradition. So what I'll do is I'll ask a few questions, and I'm going to open it up for our guests to ask each other questions and have a friendly conversation. And then after that, we will do chat questions. So go ahead and hold off on asking your chat questions towards the end. I'll prompt everyone to put them in the queue whenever we're ready. If you put them in too early, I might not be able to see them. So hold off until I call for them. Dr. Goff, I wanted to start with you. So coming from the Scotist tradition, can you maybe explain to us, first of all, what is the essence and energies distinction for anybody who's not familiar with this? And then also, could you perhaps explain where does the Scotist tradition land on this matter? Is there, in fact, a distinction in God?
Well, that's a good question. Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Dr. Bradshaw, for coming together and talking about this. To answer your question directly, in terms of the distinction and the terminology used, I don't think you'd find distinction between essence and energies as such. According to the terms, it would be more the distinction between essence and perfections or formalities or operations. And that distinction would simply be that clearly God's essence is formally and radically infinite. And so if you have an infinite being, you're having to deal with something that is maximally perfect beyond comprehension. But nevertheless, he does operate and create. And some of his actions terminate ad extra, what we would call its termination in creation. So Scotus and the Franciscan tradition, I think, following largely upon some foundations laid in the early Franciscan tradition with figures like Bonaventure, Peter John of Bolivia, and other figures, would simply try to articulate what I think is something close to an essence energies distinction by simply recognizing that certain perfections or operations of God, what I see to be analogously used in somebody like St. Maximus between, say, the logos and the logi, or the essence and the energies with St. Gregory Palamas. What is trying to be affirmed here is that these operations or energies are irreducibly distinct from one another. Yet God cannot be composed. Otherwise, you'd fall into the risk of saying that there are as many gods as energies. So they're trying to, Scotus is trying to affirm the objectivity and reality of the non-composedness and absolute perfection of God on the one hand, while saying that he does operate, and there is a certain manner in which we have to recognize distinctions within God that don't imply composition or imperfection within God, yet nevertheless are able to be in some way comprehended, are able to be in God himself actualized ad extra. So God, in a sense, cannot simply act through his infinite power ad extra and have that terminate in an infinite existence itself. That would be a contradiction. That would, in a sense, be a multiplication of God himself. So he has to be able to act in a manner that allows the possibility of creation as such. And so he operates in terms of perfections or energies that are conceptually not infinite in themselves, but nevertheless, because of their mode of existence in God, they have the character of formal infinity. Thus, they're not separated or separable from God, but nevertheless, he can operate ad extra in terms of these energies, and these energies can then be manifested in a finite mode in creation. And I think the key point here that Scotus is trying to get at, and the Franciscans are trying to protect, is both the reality of the radical unity of God, while affirming that there are or is distinction within God in terms of his perfections and the manifestation of his perfections through his energies ad extra that are prior to the mind's operation. The mind doesn't come to these different perfections and say, well, let's draw a distinction here to help us better understand. Scotus is wanting to say, no, there is an objective difference between these perfections and these operations prior to the mind's activity. And so the formal distinction is used in order to explain this distinction with respect to God's essence as infinite, but nevertheless God having different energies or perfections or operations through which he acts, which are eternally in act and which allow us to participate in creation in a finite mode, but nevertheless allowing God to move ad extra. And for Scotus, I think the simplest thing to do is just simply give what he says basically are the four conditions that are in place for a formal distinction. And so he would say any two items or multiple items under consideration are in act prior to the operation of a mind. And such items, justice, wisdom, intellect, will, they have a formal quitative being, and this being is not merely virtual. So it's not latent, it's not waiting to be actualized. No, it's already prior in act. And these items are actually distinct from each other, meaning they're irreducibly different. They're not confused. They're not waiting to be analyzed further. These are simply what Scotus will call pure perfections, irreducible perfections that are distinct, but nevertheless, in the case of God, because he is infinite being, Scotus will have a whole metaphysics of the compossibility of these different formalities or perfections in terms of his understanding of metaphysical infinity with respect to God. So such items have real being or real identity in being or essence. They're not simply virtual, and they're not also implying for Scotus that God is composed of parts or able to be composed of parts. So that's kind of a long way of answering a fairly tricky and short question. But in sum, you won't see Scotus using the essence energies distinction. And I think what's of interest for ecumenical dialogue and more philosophical theological dialogue is seeing certain parallels or certain echoes in other traditions that might establish a greater continuity between the two traditions for the sake of unity and better understanding, mutual understanding.
Excellent. And by the way, can y'all still hear me well?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Dr. Bradshaw, I want to essentially ask you the same question. Could you explain for us from your tradition what is the essence and energies distinction, and then perhaps kind of elaborate a little bit further on palamism and of course where it lands on this matter?
Yeah, so energy is a word that we use to translate energia. It actually derives from that Greek term energia, which is a word used by St. Paul. There's a whole word group in Greek. There's the noun energia, also the verb energein, that has both an active and a passive voice, energesthai. And then there's a further word, energema, from the same root. Okay, so there's this whole word group that's present in the New Testament, and I think is important for St. Paul. And in fact, if you look at the occurrence of these words in the New Testament, almost all the uses are by St. Paul. And St. Paul uses them in a way that I think is distinctive compared to earlier Greek literature, even people like Philo of Alexandria, the Septuagint, who were important for his background and kind of linguistically important. But what's new in Paul is that he uses these words only of spiritual agents, that being God or Christ or the Holy Spirit, or in 1st and 2nd Thessalonians also Satan or demons. But the reason he does so, and what I think is significant there, is that it becomes a term for the activity, and that's the original meaning of the word energia, activity. The activity of one agent, such as God or Christ, that is actively present in another agent, such as a human being, including even St. Paul, he gives himself as an example of this. And by its presence and its activity, it enables that creature then to be and to do things it couldn't do otherwise. Okay, and that's why the translation is energy and not just activity, all right, kind of comes into play. Because an energy is precisely something that enables something, an agent, to do things it couldn't do otherwise. So that divine activity that's present in us in many different forms, is also a kind of an energy. And that I think is already true in the New Testament. All right. So, for instance, in Colossians 1:29, there's an interesting verse where Paul uses both the noun and the verb. He refers to the energia of Christ that is being energumene, that is being realized or made effective within him and his ministry. All right. And so it's that energy of Christ that is being manifested through him, but not in a way that makes Paul passive, just a sort of a conduit, but rather in a way in which his activity becomes also God's activity. And that's what's meant, of course, by synergy. You know, synergy, another key term in Greek patristic theology. It's not just cooperation. I mean, that's maybe the best translation you can give. But synergy is really this more kind of intimate relationship in which the creature's activity becomes also a kind of divine activity. All right. And so God is acting in and through that creature, but the creature remains totally free. And in fact, I would say is in fact even more free than when separated from God. It's precisely the nature of sin that it diminishes our freedom. So that's sort of the New Testament origin of this concept. And as it was developed in patristic theology, that idea of energy is really, I think, probably the central core around which other things then sort of coalesce over time. And probably the most influential passage was 1 Corinthians 12, because there where St. Paul is talking about the gifts of the Spirit, things like prophecy and healing, but also things like faith and wisdom. Those are all gifts of the Spirit. And he uses, again, this same word group. He says that there are things that the Spirit energe, that he performs or realizes or makes actual, and that they themselves are energemata of the Spirit. So St. Basil, in his work on the Holy Spirit, kind of adopts that terminology and refers to them as energei of the Spirit, energies of the Spirit. And so that is one central meaning of the term, probably in a sense, the original meaning. But Basil also, in another text, Epistle 234, he uses this same term, energia, but he uses it here in distinction from ousia, essence or substance. And so he says that that God comes down to us in his energies, but his ousia, his essence, remains beyond our reach. And the background to that, and the reason that Basil distinguishes the two in that way, comes out of the Eunomian controversy. Eunomius being an Arian of the mid-4th century, the time Basil was writing, who had claimed to be able to define what is the ousia of God. And for Eunomius, as an Arian, the definition that he advocated was that it consists in being ungenerated, agenitos. And since the Son is begotten, genitos, therefore the Son is not God by that definition. Well, so Basil, along with the other Cappadocians, his brother Gregory Nyssa, and also Gregory Nazianzen, all rejected this strongly. And they said that no, we do not know what the ousia of God is, and no creature could possibly know that. That kind of led then to this introduction of the polarity between ousia and energia. All right, that the ousia of God remains beyond our reach, beyond our knowledge, but it is the source, and it is manifested in the energies that include, again, the gifts of the Spirit, but Basil also includes other forms of divine action and presence, including providence and wisdom and foreknowledge. And then in Gregory, his brother, Gregory of Nyssa, he says that in fact all the names that we give to God, and by name, that he's using that the way that it was traditionally used at that time, as sort of any term that designates God with reference to what God is in his own right, if you will, and not just a sort of a relationship like king or lord. But terms like good and wise and holy and powerful and so forth are all names of some form of the divine energy. Okay. And that was not really a radical idea. In fact, if you go back to Philo of Alexandria, first century, he had said something kind of similar about the divine powers, dunamis. And for Philo, there are two main divine powers, the creative power and the ruling power. And the word theos, God, is the name of the creative power, and Kyrios, Lord, is the name of the ruling power. And so that idea is already present there in Philo. What Gregory does is, I think, to shift the terminology a little bit in a way that kind of brings it into line with what Basil had said and with this existing biblical idea of the divine energy. But also what you see is happening there is that this concept of the divine energy is sort of expanding, not just the energies of the spirit, but also what we would call the divine attributes, goodness, wisdom, power. For the Cappadocians, those are divine names, and they're names of energies, which are not something distinct from God, but they are distinct from the divine essence in this epistemological sense that they insist upon in reaction to eunomius, okay, that the essence always remains beyond our knowledge, but is manifested in and through the energies. Okay, so that's sort of the foundation. And as time goes by, there's a sort of a further accretion, if you will. I have a book about this, as you well know, Aristotle, East and West, that goes through this and a lot of this history in some detail. One step along the way, really, you might say kind of two steps, really occur with St. Maximus the Confessor in the 7th century. So one of them is something Dr. Goff referred to a little bit ago, the divine logi, or if you want to speak classically, the logoi, the plural, the logos. But what Maximus teaches, following Origen and Vagrius, is that every creature has its own distinct logos that brings it into being, and that is sort of God's creative act in relation to that creature. And he uses the definition that Dionysius the Areopagite had given for that sense of the word logos in relation to creature as a divine and good act of will. Okay, thelema, act of will. That's in Divine Names, chapter 5. So the logi then are the divine and good acts of will by which God creates. And that's in Maximus. Later in the tradition, Gregory Palamas, the guy you mentioned in your question, he's writing in the 14th century, so considerably later. But he's the one who tries to sort of synthesize and draw together these diverse strands and give a single coherent account. Well, he identifies the logi because they are acts of will, which is a form of activity, right, as among the divine energies, all right? So that's something else that's then is sort of embraced into that concept. And then one other key idea that's there in Maximus that also, is then included by Palamas as well, the idea of God's natural energy. Okay, this is something that was very important in the controversy that led up to the Sixth Ecumenical Council. That controversy began with what's called monoenergism. And that was put forward by one of the patriarchs of Constantinople. His name slips my mind right now. But it was an attempt to find a kind of a common ground or a middle point of agreement with the non-Chalcedonians, okay, the people that we today call Monophysites, saying that there are two natures in Christ, divine and human, but one single energy. Okay, that's where the term monoenergism comes from, a single energy that is itself both divine and human. Well, Maximus rejected that, and he said, no, if the assertion of two natures divine and human, is going to have any real substance and validity, it has to then imply that there are also two distinct energies, one divine, one human. And so he said these are what he called natural energies that are sort of intrinsic to the nature, that are not only activities. Okay, so semantically, this is significant because what you're seeing here is that the word energy is in a sense sort of becoming the predominant meaning, whereas activity, which was the original meaning, is sort of falling somewhat to the background, because they're present and real and distinct even when not necessarily manifest. Okay, and so that's what's often referred to as God's natural energies. And we're kind of looking back at Basil. What he does is to identify these as what we would call divine attributes, things like goodness and wisdom and power, but they're natural energies. And this was affirmed at the Sixth Ecumenical Council that did identify, yes, there are, Christ has both human and divine natural energies. So it became part of, if you will, conciliar theology from that point. And Palamas includes that as well, in his work, the Triads, in defense of the Hesychus and Manathos. When he introduces the concept of divine energy, that's actually how he does it initially, is with reference to the teaching of the Sixth Council and St. Maximus about God's natural energies. All right, so all of that then, all of that has to be kind of kept in mind and included when you talk about the divine energies in the Greek patristic tradition. I mean, the energies of the Spirit that St. Paul talks about, the energies that are including things like foreknowledge and providence and wisdom and power that are distinct from the essence, the way St. Basil describes, that the energies are the referent of names said of God, the way Gregory of Nyssa puts it, as well as then that the logi in St. Maximus are a form of divine energy, and the natural energies, which again kind of overlap with what St. Basil said, but you do get, I think, a distinctive terminology there from Maximus and the Sixth Council. So I realize that's a long, complex answer, but it's why I don't think the concept of energy itself doesn't map neatly onto anything that we find in Western theology of the same period. Primarily, it's a linguistic difference. And actually, if you look at the New Testament, you can already see that difference emerging in the way that those terms, as they're used by St. Paul, were then translated into Latin in the Vulgate. Because in the Vulgate, it's operatio, and the verb is operatur. But there's a real problem because operatur is deponent. And so it's passive in form, but active in meaning. And so the Vulgate uses that verb, operatur, to translate both the active instances of energein, the verb, and the passive, energeistai. And if you look at these, I've written an article where I go into this in some detail, about 24 occurrences of this word group in St. Paul. If you look at how they end up being translated into Latin in the Vulgate, there's a lot of nuance that gets obscured. And I think the result was that this concept of energy as the form of a divine activity that enables and empowers us to act synergistically with God itself is obscured. And it doesn't really become a kind of a central core concept in the West in the way that it did in the East. And that's again just a linguistic difference because of the different vocabularies we're dealing with. But it did have theological implications over time. So that's what has kind of left us in this situation we're in, where we've got to try to think about two different conceptual schemes and how they relate and can be mapped in relation to each other, even though there's really not a perfect one-to-one match.
Excellent explanation there, Dr. Bradshaw. I really appreciate that. Now, I do have some follow-up questions. Let me start with you, Dr. Goff. Can we even speak about this matter from a Catholic perspective? Is one actually bound to the Thomistic understanding, Or would you say that no, the Scotist tradition is something that a Catholic is able to maintain? And why would you say that a Catholic is free to hold to Scotus's opinion on this?
Well, yeah, I would say that, one thing that still remains is there a consistent semantical use, with this distinction between essence and energies in the Greek uh, tradition, especially terminating and kind of, in a sense, culminating in Saint Gregory Palamas, that can be, in a sense, consistently used across all these different forms of distinctions, because in some way, I think I can, and I do agree with everything Dr. Bradshaw was saying. But in terms of coming to an understanding of what the nature of the distinction between essence and energies actually is functionally, from a philosophical theological standpoint, I still have lack of clarity. And in some sense, this is why I think this conversation is so interesting, because in the West, you simply have three basic distinctions: a real distinction, a formal distinction, and various virtual distinctions or distinctions of reason. And I suppose, in terms of my understanding, I can't see the consistency of usage in terms of real distinctions. So it's hard for me to say what's included or excluded vis-a-vis Western theological and metaphysical discussion. So I suppose now I'll answer your question, because I feel like there's a great deal of agreement. But I'm still unclear exactly how the distinction functions consistently, or is it more of an analogical range of usages that will be determined by context? And I think that that can be appropriate, but that requires a great deal more, I suppose, dialogue and contextualizing discussion. Now, getting to your question about St. Thomas Aquinas and his view of simplicity and other views of simplicity, the simple answer, and I suppose I would refer you to that earlier talk we had last year where I went into much more historical detail. But the short answer is no, one does not seem to be bound by the church in any of her doctrinal or dogmatic pronouncements regarding the simplicity of God to holding the theological or metaphysical account of St. Thomas. And, there are a couple, I think, really good basic reasons. Is one, the doctrine of simplicity was actually defined and imposed in its general sense before Aquinas was even born. I'm thinking in the early 13th century. And so basically what is being stated is that God cannot be something that is composed or able to be composed. God is perfectly himself, and in this sense, independent from anything other than himself. So I think that's the first thing to consider. And the second thing to consider is the fact that up until really 1879 and Pope Leo XIII's encyclical Aeterni Patris, which in itself did carry some qualifications regarding schools of thought within the Catholic tradition. But going back prior to that pronouncement or encyclical of Pope Leo XIII, the Franciscan school, inclusive of Bonaventure Scotus, was not just tolerated, it was actually encouraged. And so everything that follows within that school, and interestingly, let me add a parenthetical, is I love Dr. Bradshaw's mention of Dionysius, because Bonaventure uses the exact same text as St. Maximus in, I believe, Ad Thalassium 60, in his second question on the knowledge of Christ, in his disputations on the knowledge of Christ, when he's talking about the divine ideas. And he says, Dionysius writes, "We say that the exemplar, or of existing beings, pre-exist in God in a singular way as substantial reasons, which theology calls predefinitions." I'm reading an English translation. They are the good and divine acts of will which determine and created existing beings. It is in accordance with these that the substantial existence predefines and produces all things. And so, interestingly, you have the same passage being used in a similar context, the knowledge of Christ, and really the knowledge or the possession of God of these eternal logi or divine exemplars in St. Bonaventure. But what this opens up then is a conception of simplicity that allows for an affirmation that infinity is not simply the absence of a circumscribing form, as you'll find in St. Thomas, which then would say any distinction that we see in God is merely virtual and is only manifest or made actual upon the mind operating and seeing actual distinctions through creation as such. So God creates different items. Therefore, these virtually distinct items in the mind of God eternally become manifestly distinct in and through the fact that he creates. But you can't superimpose or retroject a kind of objective distinction in God prior to creation. So this is the important distinction between a real or formal distinction and a merely virtual distinction. But what this opens up for in St. Bonaventure is, twin ideas. One is that the essence of God is absolutely infinite. It's incomprehensible by a finite mind because of its positive perfection. And then because of God's positive perfection, which includes what we would call the perfection or natural energy of intellection, God knows not only all actual or future beings, but he knows all possible beings. Thus, you have an actual infinity of logi or exemplars in terms of possibles that God possesses. So what my point here is that it's opening up on an explanation of the divine being in terms of positive infinity. And so then you have to say, well, how do we distinguish between these different perfections, these different ideas? And this is where Scotus's account, taking these distinctions already established in Bonaventure and developing them and saying, what kind of distinction do we need to apply? Well, it can't be real in terms of the possibility that these items in God, or the essence and the energies, can be really distinct as inseparable or independent from one another, because God is simply one. But on the other hand, we have to affirm that because God is infinitely perfect, he has an infinite number of exemplar ideas or logi, these predefinitions, these acts, these good acts of will that terminate in creation. In terms of their manifestation, we then have to seek an explanation. And this is where I think the formal distinction is very helpful metaphysically in trying to deal with these realities that are laid out in Scripture, as Dr. Bradshaw stated, in the tradition, that require an explanation different than perhaps the more Aristotelian Greek understanding of simplicity. And so, given the fact that Bonaventure was probably the most important churchman of the late 13th century, and then later declared a saint and a doctor of the church in 1474, and then declared a primary doctor of the church with St. Thomas Aquinas. And then following the development of the Franciscan school, which includes Scotus, because both Paul VI and John Paul II say Scotus is the perfecter of Bonaventure from within the Franciscan school, recommended for subjects of metaphysical theology, apologetics, that sort of thing. I think it is an indication that the Scotistic position is perfectly acceptable within the Catholic framework, and one is not simply bound towards following St. Thomas's account of simplicity alone to the exclusion of other positions, precisely because of the real difficulties raised by St. Thomas's position that the Scotistic account or the Palamite account might be able to address more easily and more clearly. So I think yes, certainly Scotus's position as a development of the Western metaphysical, the Augustinian, coupled with the Cappadocians through St. John of Damascus, that tradition certainly is fruitful and perfectly valid for Catholics to accept and to think in terms of.
Now, I also want to ask you, Dr. Bradshaw, a follow-up question, and then I'm going to open it up for y'all to have a discussion. You have mentioned one of the Cappadocians. I want to say it was Basil. I want to say it was one of his letters, where he speaks about God's essence is beyond our reach. Somebody, when they hear that, and they're not very well trained in this matter, they might say, well, okay, if God's essence is beyond our reach, does that then mean that we never truly know God? How would you answer that?
Well, so another idea that's in Gregory of Nyssa and a lot of the later fathers is what's called perpetual progress, that in the afterlife, there's an unending movement forward toward deeper and deeper knowledge of God, but that because God is infinite, okay, that's obviously something we all agree on, then that knowledge, that progress never comes to an end. And the way Gregory develops that is actually with reference to God as the good. He kind of picks up this classical idea that I think is in Aristotle and Plato, that by doing good, you're capable of enjoying the good more. Okay, Aristotle says that by developing a virtue, you come to enjoy and to recognize as pleasant the corresponding virtuous act in a way that you didn't before. And that virtuous act, he says, is pleasant by nature. And when we're not yet in the virtuous state, we simply don't experience it as what it really is. So anyway, that's a kind of a precedent for this idea in Gregory that the blessed grow in goodness, and by growing in goodness, they also grow in their capacity to know and enjoy the presence of God. And that's an unending process. So, it's not that the essence and the energies are sort of separated by a wall that you never pass beyond, because there's not a fixed boundary here. It's rather more like a receding horizon. That's an analogy I've offered elsewhere, that if you think of your progress across a plane, there's always the horizon before you, even though the point where you are now is the one that appeared to be the horizon, miles back. Well, that's the analogy I would offer for this unending progress into the knowledge of God, that there's always more beyond. And that more which is beyond is itself the source of what you're experiencing here and now. But precisely because there's always more, you never really know God fully and finally and utterly the way that he knows himself. All right, and that's another way you can put this distinction, is that the divine essence is God as he is known to himself, in himself, and the energies are as he is known and manifest to creatures. And this is not only human creatures, also angels would be subject to the same sort of format, or what's the scheme, in which they know God through his energies, his energetic manifestation, but his ousia remains always beyond as something unknown. All right, so I hope that kind of dispels that sense, which, you're right to raise that, because it's often an objection that is raised, that there's sort of God as we know him versus God as he really is, or something like that. That's not it at all. God as we know him is God as he really is, but we're finite. We can never know him fully and completely and finally. All right, so there were some other things that came up, but I trust we'll get back to those.
Well, if you want to go ahead and take some time to maybe address that, give any comments that you want, and then ask Dr. Goff some questions. And then what I'll do is pass it over to Dr. Goff. He can give some of his comments and then ask you some questions. So if y'all want to go ahead and start that, that's fine. So yeah, any comments that you had on your mind, and then questions.
Well, actually, so I did have a question for Dr. Goff. Something you just mentioned that I found very interesting, that wasn't familiar to me. You said that Bonaventure, in referring to the idea of the divine logi, which he finds in Maximus and Dionysius, that he says there are logi of possible creatures that God never actually creates. Is that correct? And if that's true, go ahead.
I'm sorry, go ahead. You didn't finish your question.
Well, yeah, so if that's true, I think that would be an important difference, because the logi, as I understand them in the Greek tradition, are always of things that God actually does create. And that's part of what's sort of the force of saying that they are acts of will. They're the acts of will by which he does create. And yes, there's an infinite range of other things he could create and doesn't. But as far as I know, they don't use the word logi for those. And they don't really have much of a theory about those. I mean, it's kind of frustrating for a modern philosopher, because they don't really discuss that, except I know there is a passage in John of Damascus where he says, the issue is, well, does God know all the things that he could create but doesn't create? And John actually says no, because something that isn't real isn't a possible object of knowledge. He's using that classical correlation of knowledge with being, that you can find as far back as, say, Parmenides and Plato in the Republic, Book 5, that the objects of knowledge are the things that are. And so for John, whatever kind of thought God would have in relation to the things that he could create or doesn't create, whatever it is, it's not knowledge, episteme. Okay.
Right.
So that's kind of an interesting difference in the way they seem to be thinking about this, but I wonder what's your take on that?
Yeah, there's more to be said about that, and forgive me for the interjection, the parenthetical interjection, but I thought it was interesting to see the same passage from Dionysius being cited by Bonaventure independently of knowledge of Maximus and his citation of that passage. Yes, you raise an important question, because in the Western tradition, and you find this clearly in Bonaventure and Scotus, it's a big point of emphasis that only God renders his knowledge and his power finite. And there's some sort of tension or distinction even between God in his essence and personal existence and what God can do through his acts of will, or what he knows in terms of his act of knowledge. So Bonaventure would say, yes, God does know the extent of his own power, and so he would have a knowledge, he would call these ideas, of everything he could create, everything possible to his power. But here's where, and this is the important distinction that he makes in question 2, where in my brief interlude or interjection, there was a possible conflation, is that he does distinguish, though, between ideas as such, meaning the representation of all that God knows, eternally manifesting or expressing this eternal truth that he has, which would include everything that's possible, everything that's knowable. That would be extensively infinite for Bonaventure and in perfect act. But he then distinguishes an idea as this notion of posse, or possibility, from what he would then call exemplar. An exemplar then has this precise note of a predefinition or a goodwill that he's using Dionysius. So he distinguishes within the knowledge of God these ideas as possible. So it seems like it goes beyond what the Greek tradition would allow. But in terms of this direct correlation between logi and Bonaventure's notion of exemplar, it has this direct connotation, in a sense earmarked by the divine will, that God actually wills to create X, Y, and Z. And so this is not his simple knowledge, but this is his knowledge of approbation, those things which he will do ad extra, or which he is creating ad extra. So there is the same distinction, but Bonaventure and Scotus will simply go beyond and say, well, God does know the extent of his power, and he knows everything that he could create, any kind of variation on a divine idea in terms of possible divine ideas. And they will use certain analogies that we could imagine, certain types of things that we will never, or certain types of actions that we will never see, never experience, or never create or do. Nevertheless, they are ideas of something. They have a reference as expressing some form of truth, but as you say, they don't express a real term. And those things that express real terms of God's will act, that's what Bonaventure calls exemplar, as distinct from idea. So the same distinction is made, but they will just claim that God's amplitude or extension of knowledge is broader than what the Greek tradition will typically deal with.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so can I comment on that? I mean, there are a lot of important issues here that I certainly don't have all the answers to. And some of it takes us sort of beyond the historical comparison into, real live issues in philosophy of religion that are still very hotly debated. So one concern I have, and I see this a lot when I read contemporary philosophy of religion, is that divine omniscience can be taken in such a way that creation becomes simply an act of selection. God knows all possible worlds, and he picks one as the one that he's going to realize. And of course, then there's a further debate. Does that one have to be the best of all possible worlds, etc.? But even leaving that aside, I think it's problematic to kind of reduce creation to selection in that sort of a way. It's certainly not the way creation is portrayed in Genesis. In Genesis, it's actually portrayed in sequence, right? And at each stage, God kind of steps back and beholds the what he's made is good. And it seems to be more, if there's an analogy, it's not that of someone kind of picking one button, pressing one button among others. It's the analogy of artistic creation. Kind of like the artist who's painting the canvas steps back and admires it, says, this is good so far, now I'm going to do this. And then again steps back and then says, now I'm going to do this and this. Now that's, of course, there are a lot of different ways you can read Genesis, and I don't want to um, put too much weight on that per se, but I do think it's problematic philosophically to reduce creation to selection of one world among a vast infinite array, all of which are fully present to the divine mind. I mean, the other alternative that I think should be considered is something more like artistic creation, where what's possible is at any given stage is sort of something that opens up in light of what's already been done at the prior stage. So that it's sort of a progressive dynamic growth. And that's sort of, it seems to me, I mean, if the way that the Greek fathers at least tend to think of creation, in line with that portrayal in Genesis, as this sort of progressive realization in which God manifests his goodness in progressively concrete ways, that he doesn't just choose from some existing prior matrix, but that he kind of creatively realizes. Now, I understand the point you make, and that Bonaventure makes, that God knows his own power. And I can see the inference to say, well, because of that, he must have this kind of prior knowledge of all possibilities that he could create. But it's a tricky issue because, of course, we're talking about an infinite mind knowing an infinite object. And the other thing that's tricky is that, this is something else that people have discussed pretty intensely in contemporary ontology. You get into this whole issue of the modality of possible worlds, where it's not clear that there is some reality to be known if the question is, what is the particular identity of this particular individual existing in a world utterly, totally different from the actual world? It's simply that there is no, given that there's no sort of history of prior actuality by which those possibilities can be defined, it's not clear that there's any determinate object of knowledge there that can be, identified and defined. So again, that's controversial, but that's a position that a lot of people would argue today, in reference. Jonathan Jacobs, I think, has done some really good work about this. He's at St. Louis University, just looking at the ontology of modality. So I'm a little hesitant, when I hear this. I understand your distinction between idea and exemplar, but I'm a little hesitant with the idea that the divine ideas sort of encompass everything possible, simply because I'm not sure that's actually a well-defined category or concept, if it's understood as a sort of defined already prior to the creative act. That's the worry that I have, and I just wonder, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, that's a difficult discussion, and I think, just to set some boundaries, I think one thing to consider is that in terms of the motivation for creation, the standard understanding of the Franciscan school, especially following Scotus, is very closely aligned to what St. Maximus the Confessor would say. Is, in a sense, the purpose of creation is for the sake of the incarnation, the perfect manifestation and termination ad extra of the divine influence, presence, and operation, wherein a created nature is actually subsisting in a divine person. And so this, in a sense, for the Franciscan school, there's a certain approach to the priority of Christ. So the motivation for creation is not a kind of, Guanilo in his debate with Anselm, the dialogue, where the interlocutor of Anselm asks, well, is there such a thing as the most perfect island? And of course, you see the absurdity of that kind of question. What do you mean by most perfect island in the realm of natural activity, natural processes, natural causes? Because anything that is a finite composite nature is susceptible to increase in a multitude of ways. And so Bonaventure's response to this is just, this simply is a misunderstanding of the problem, and it's a locating of it's a question that's important, but it's a question with reference to the wrong kind of item, because it's inconceivable that there is a most perfect kind of island. There is a most perfect kind of created order. that would then necessitate, if one is going to will in an orderly or meaningful manner, that he must will this reality and not that reality. God, in a sense, there are certain limitations. God cannot create qua nature something that is absolutely perfect in terms of the full manifestation of its range of possibilities, just simply because of the possibility of diminution, augmentation, change. And so I think in that sense, you're right. It does raise the question of possible worlds, different modalities. But with the Franciscan tradition, they don't locate an explanation for creation in terms of selecting a number of possible scenarios in the created order. And I'm not even exactly sure how Bonaventure would have conceived of these divine ideas as terms of knowledge with this distinctness that is certainly manifest through God's will to create. Clearly, God knows creation through his act of willing to create these things in virtue of or through his knowledge of the exemplar of the Logi. So you raise an important point. Is it just merely a question of selecting X world out of an infinite number of possible worlds? I don't think that's how Bonaventure or Scotus would like to explain it. They would say, perhaps that doesn't allow an explanation, but what we do have is the primacy or priority and fittingness. And I love your artistic analogy because this is a central theme of Franciscan epistemology. There's an aesthetic rationality. You see the beauty of the beginning, the middle, and the end, and how the whole tapestry fits together. And this is a primary way of approaching these things. It's the famous Scotistic, argument for the Immaculate Conception. Potuit, is it possible? Decuit, is it fitting, or is it beautiful, or is it convenient? And you find the term conveniencia in Bonaventure all throughout his writings. Is this convenient or fitting? Therefore, it's done. And that doesn't work on its own, but it does show you a certain mindset that what the creature does with respect to God's will to create and God's purposes for creation is actually look at what God did and then try to analyze and fit how he's manifesting his goodwill in time in an orderly manner. So it's not so much analyzing natures and their processes as abstracted from the primary motivation and term of why God does anything ad extra. And so, kind of wrapping up this explanation then, is that for Bonaventure and Scotus, they wouldn't so much address the problems you're raising because there are certain paradoxical situations or relationships, maybe antinomies that you arrive at if you sit in that realm. But they don't seek to explain this. They seek to view God as the perfect artist who, in acting ad extra, there's this moment of beauty, of unity and order, ultimately for the sake of incarnation and union with and between human persons in the divine Trinity. And so how is this is the motivation. But from a Catholic point of view, especially a Franciscan point of view, there would be a distinction between nature and grace. So nature wouldn't explain its own purposes. Grace would, right? And the grace of the incarnation, A, the hypostatic union, and then B, the influence, presence, and energies appropriated to the Holy Spirit in the created nature of Christ, and then in and throughout creation in terms especially of the church, the mystical body through its sacramental life, and those sorts of things. But an important caveat or distinction then, if you say, well, there is a distinction then between nature and grace, it's how the Franciscan school distinguishes between nature and grace. Because a big complaint against Latin theology is that you have this reification and separation of nature and grace, and then you have this notion of created grace, where created grace becomes an internal, possessed habit, a kind of quasi or accidental proprium of the created person under the influence and operation of this grace. But what the Franciscans will simply do is it's not grace, nature and grace are not specified by different objects, primarily, or even by uncreated and created accidents. There is that component, clearly that can't be denied, that's in Trinity. But what they will say the primary distinction between nature and grace is the act of a divine person or agent operating to raise a created person to a supernatural mode of activity. And this supernatural mode of activity is very similar to what we see with the energies of the Spirit. The energies of the Spirit create in us a conformity or likeness to God. This was what we would call participation. But the Spirit, more importantly, allows those conformities, these likenesses, to operate in a personal way that affect interpersonal union beyond mere participation, in the sense that there's a parallelism, there is a likeness or a similarity or a created image. But more importantly, this allows for interpersonal communion. And so the object, or the distinction between nature and grace, is not so much between a natural object as end, as known and willed, and a supernatural object as known and willed, but rather you have the same object rooted in the same end of creation, flowing from the same triune God, that oscillates or modulates the way in which we operate. So the distinction here then is not between a distinction of objects or ends primarily, but a distinction of modalities. And this is the primary distinction. So then if you say, okay, I see that creation is moded for the purpose of the incarnation, well, then I can see, well, obviously it's not really a matter of choice, because if God chooses to create, and he's the most orderly lover and creator, and there is this reality or possibility to become incarnate, and he in fact does this, then you can see, well, actually this is what determines the motivation for God to create this order rather than that order. And it's so it locates the kind of answer away from just mere possibilities, and you have some concrete reality that then you can latch onto and then begin your explanation. But clearly it's moving from a purely or an abstractedly natural analysis of created natures and their interrelations, processes, and ends, to a theological reality which is only revealed in Christ, in a sense, as a recapitulation of the creation in Genesis itself. Because Bonaventure, and you mentioned this beautiful notion of a process of creation over 6 days, Bonaventure takes that same approach and says, well, this has theological import in determining how God chooses to manifest himself as a creator, not so much as a power, but as an artist, with ends that exceed what we can achieve or know by nature alone, and require revelation to establish those ends and accomplish those ends.
So could I just to try to understand this, how then do they resist, or how would they resist the attempt of someone like, suppose Plantinga could have a conversation with Bonaventure about God's act of creation. Okay, and for Plantinga, it's simply selecting a possible world among others. What would they say to that? I mean, how would they resist that kind of a move? I understand that they like the artistic analogy, but in terms of the metaphysical sort of reality that's there, what is God doing that can't be understood simply as selection?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And there is a strong notion of election or predetermination in a certain sense in the Western tradition. I think you can't avoid that if you're thinking and reasoning from within a generally Augustinian framework. And I think, medieval theologians, the Franciscans especially, were very concerned to not, in a sense, constrain in any sense God's activity ad intra with respect to creation. And so in this sense, then, he does will to create a certain order, but it's not as though he could only create that certain order. And it's not as though he has no idea of other possibilities. And I think this is rooted in their desire to preserve the freedom of God vis-a-vis A, the act of creation, and B, what sort of creation actually took place. And they will say why God selected, if there is a selection, and I think you have to concede there is. Why God selected is not determined by considerations of nature alone. It's actually determined or motivated in terms of the purposes of the most perfect ad extra communication of himself, and then in virtue of the establishment of the mystical body of Christ. And so you can say, I think the question would be, I don't know how you would answer that question directly, other than to say, though, he did in fact select what was actually the best. And that is the most fitting activity of God. In terms of what God can select versus what God did select, I think that's a real question, but I don't really have a problem with it so much. It doesn't raise a certain problem, because I've already admitted that whatever God could have done, this is what he actually did. And given the reality of the incarnation and the nature of the incarnation as hypostatic union, and then the reality of deification and sanctification in the church for the sake of perfect union with the Trinity, I would say, well, this is sufficient for me to understand. Even if God could have done other things, he in fact did this, and this seems like the best he could have done. Now, when you get into questions of theodicy, sin, that's another topic which raises a whole number of issues. But I think one could concede your problem, but then say the problem may be slightly blunted just simply because of the fact that the end of nature that God actually willed is supernature, meaning hypostatic union, recapitulation in Christ, and return to the Father in the Spirit. So it's not primarily explained in terms of mere natural possibilities or alternatives. Actually, we're getting right to the root and the heart and the height through the incarnation itself and God's plan for salvation. So I think that would be a way of addressing it, but it doesn't solve the problems you raise as such. But then perhaps my counter suggestion would be, well, maybe this idea of selection is not as problematic given the fact of the incarnation and the actual single-willed economy of salvation.
Okay. I'll let it go there because Michael, you said you had some issues.
Yeah, well, Dr. Goff, did you have any questions for Dr. Bradshaw before we go to any of those?
Yeah. You know, I probably initially should have given more of a historical account, because I see now that it was probably very helpful of the development of the formal distinction and how it's been used and how it might have implication for East-West discussions between or about the formal distinction, essence energies distinction, how these things may be similar, maybe overlap, maybe a way of establishing common ground. But my question is, I suppose, is that when you see the real distinction being used between essence and energies, what I still am not quite clear about is really two things. One is it the common understanding that in the West there simply is no functional parallel or functional analog to the essence energies distinction? I guess that's the first question. And the second one is it the case, or is it possible that the essence energies distinction in the Palamite tradition, and I'm thinking of somebody like Gennadius Scholarius, who really tries to pin it down and ends up kind of siding with or affirming the applicability or appropriateness of the Franciscan formal distinction. But historically speaking, from your perspective, is the essence energies distinction as real? Is that used in different modalities? Whereas, in one usage, it could be more like a Thomistic real distinction. In other usages or contexts, it could be like a distinction of reason. And in other contexts, it could be like a formal distinction.
Mm-hmm.
Or is it simply, yeah.
Broadly speaking, palamas certainly never refers to it as a real distinction. That's just terminology that wasn't in use at that time. And some of his followers, in later Byzantium, refer to it as a distinction catapinia. Apinia, being concept or notion in Greek. And people have sometimes thought that, well, there's sort of a backing away, and that these later Byzantine theologians are trying to sort of minimize the ontological status of this distinction and make it just something really conceptual. I don't think that's actually the case. And I have a whole article actually about that, about the meaning of that phrase catapinian, and how in the Greek tradition, that's really not trying to identify the ontological status of a distinction at all. It's sort of an epistemological designation saying that here's a distinction we arrive at through reflection rather than immediate sense perception. And it's used very broadly. Even the three persons of the Trinity are distinct catapinian. And the two natures of Christ are distinct catapinian. So anyway, that's just, there is a Greek terminology about the nature of distinction, but it doesn't map very well onto the Latin terminology. So as to your question about, well, what kind of distinction is it then that we're looking at? I do think it's different in different cases, because, and this is a point I made in my book too, that if you look at everything that they group together as divine energies, it's a very heterogeneous grouping. You have the energies of the Spirit, You have sort of established patterns of divine activity, like foreknowledge and providence. And then you have, and of course, those exist only because creation exists, right? But then you also have what we would call divine attributes that would exist even if there were no creation, like divine goodness and wisdom and power. And then you have the logi, by which God creates, which are acts of will, as well as the divine will itself. They'll refer to as a kind of energy. Oh, and then the uncreated light. Forgot to mention that earlier, but of course that was really crucial for the whole hesychast debate in the 14th century, that the hesychastic monks identified the light that they beheld when they were engaged in prayer with the uncreated light that shined around Christ at the Transfiguration, and that presumably is also, present in other forms of the divine glory in Scripture. Okay, so the uncreated light was thought of as a sort of a physical or visible manifestation of the divine energy. Well, what you see if you look at this, all these different groups, is that some of them are necessary and some are contingent. So God could not fail to be good or powerful or wise, but the energies of the Spirit clearly are contingent. And even things like foreknowledge and providence are contingent because God didn't have to create. And some of them are eternal and some are not. God's foreknowledge, St. Basil says at one point, will pass away. And his providence will be finished when creation itself, has come to an end in the eschaton. But others clearly don't pass away. So it's a very mixed group, and therefore I think if you're going to look at it sort of through a Latin lens, and try to use these different forms of Latin distinction, you would have to recognize different kinds of distinction in different cases. I'm sympathetic, for what I understand with the idea that that is the way they understand the distinction of the essence and the energies that consist of things like goodness, wisdom, and power that are intrinsic to God. Is very similar to the Scotistic formal distinction. I think that's probably correct. It's just that the formal distinction doesn't work as well for some of these other cases, so you can't just make a blanket statement. You may know the work of Mark Spencer. He's written an article about this, kind of arguing that point. It's a complicated story, and that's what we run into when we're dealing with two languages that have the same biblical source and then develop in such radically different ways for 1,000 years without really a lot of interaction between them.
Yeah, I appreciate your comment. It is helpful. I suppose then, one way to respond to some of the distinctions you make with respect to God's contingent will acts, certain acts of God being contingent. I think it does raise a central question, and there would be ways of dealing with it differently. But the idea from sitting here from thinking in terms of Scotistic categories, the distinction between, say, providence or foreknowledge, and providence and foreknowledge ceasing at the end of creation, or in terms of its historical process, is that something where it would require a merely virtual distinction, or would it entail a real distinction? Because sitting here from a Scotistic perspective, I could see how it would be meaningfully said that, yes, foreknowledge and providence would cease functionally, because in a sense their terms would cease. But God would still maintain and know the distinction of his foreknowledge and providence eternally. But their terms, or his will acts ad extra, would cease. And so it's a question or an ambiguity between how we're understanding foreknowledge and providence, with either reference to God or with reference to their terms. And clearly, when foreknowledge and providence are actually functional, there's both happening. There's a relationship happening. But it would seem that then there's more of the verbal, active sense of foreknowledge and providence being emphasized by someone like St. Basil. But it seems difficult for me to reconcile the notion that he would say that, in a sense, God would somehow forget what those items of knowledge were and their distinction. And so in this sense, I would say, it seems like foreknowledge and, say, simple knowledge are distinct sets of knowledge, but yet they're not separable from God's being, or they're not separable or independent from one another. And I guess the question, and this is where I suppose the formal distinction would be helpful. And so I would ask then, are there instances you could think of where the real distinction, as in the Thomistic distinction, would actually be the understanding that St. Gregory and the Palamite tradition would be affirming with respect to God ad intra, or even with respect to God's activities as such, not the distinction between his activity and the created term. Clearly there's a real distinction, but between God and his activity to create. Is there, I mean, when would a real distinction, if possible, even come into play? Because it seems to me I could catalog all of these under a kind of formal distinction, understood simply in that basic 4-point definition I gave earlier. Because it's not as though God begins to, after not beginning, or not willing, begins to will after not willing. He's willing from eternity. And so there isn't this process of change he's undergoing. And so you couldn't create distension or separation between God and his act of will in that sense. And so it seems a formal distinction would be very helpful to articulating these things. But I don't know the Palamite tradition well enough to say when and what and how these things might apply.
Well, so yeah, I'll be curious what your take on this. That it seems like maybe the closest, at least, to a real distinction ad intra, which is what you asked about, would be among the logi, because they are contingent acts of will, and their distinction is ontologically prior, causally prior to the distinction of creatures, because it's what accounts for the distinction of creatures.
Yeah.
So I think the way that the Greek fathers think of it is that, yeah, there are distinct acts of will in which God does choose to create each being, could have done otherwise. And that distinction among the acts of will is what enables the distinction among creatures itself. So that, I think, I mean, if I understand the Thomistic terminology, that sounds like a real distinction, at least between, among those acts of will, because any one of them or many of them could exist without the others. And also between the essence and the acts of will, because the essence could exist without any of them. God didn't have to choose to create. So, if you understand the real distinction in terms of contingency in that way, possible separate existence, then it seems like the essence is really distinct from these acts of will.
Right.
That's my take on it. I'm not sure.
Yeah, interesting. Saint Bonaventure deals with the same kind of problem, but he would articulate according to the metaphor, the image of truth, and truth expressing. So God's essence under a certain modality, transcendental modality, or name better, would be truth. And truth is expressive in act eternally. And his truth as expressive is always expressing all of these different ideas and exemplars. And so there's a certain term of God's expression that is ad intra, that he would simply say, this is God's eternal expression within himself. And these would be what Bonaventure would call likenesses of God to creatures. But the termination is still ad intra. But nevertheless, it's the truth as expressing. And there's a certain then way in which he would say all of these different logi or exemplars are terminations of expressing truth. And so there is an objective distinctness because they're true terminations with different content. A dog is not a donkey, not a person, not Peter, not Paul. So he would say this is objective. It's not something that merely the mind brings to the question. Rather, these are objectively, eternally expressing truths. And then he would say, though, is that with respect to the truth itself, it's wanting to, in a sense, move back towards unity, but nevertheless, in their act of expressing, in the truth's act of expressing, they express distinctly. And this is why Bonaventure will argue that God must have ideas and exemplars in order to create intelligently, because he wouldn't know what he was creating. But then he would say that a distinction, the distinctness becomes more apparent in terms of thinking of the terms of God's will act to create. So these wills, these good wills that Dionysius says, insofar as they terminate in really distinct creatures, you have this idea then of expressing and connotation. The truth is eternally expressing all of these distinct exemplars. And then insofar as God actually creates through the exemplars, their terminations are real, entail a real distinction. And thus, insofar as God knows these exemplars, there's a connotation of real distinction. But because everything is happening within the divine being, you can't affirm a real distinction in terms of the expressing itself or the termination itself, because for the Western tradition, at least, especially for the Franciscans, a real distinction would entail actual or possible separability and independence in being. And so that's where I think the Franciscans would say, well, it can't be a real distinction in this sense, the hard sense of a possible separation or independent existence. But there is a real distinction insofar as these are objectively manifesting and terminating as distinct truths being eternally expressed or eternally expressing. That doesn't yet violate that notion of non-complexity or non-composability. And so perhaps that would be an area of distinction where the Franciscans would say, well, what we're dealing with is a kind of formal distinction or a manifestation of a formal distinction, and not a real distinction under the strict terms of actual separability and independence. And perhaps that's just simply a terminological difference where real is being used in a broader sense in the Byzantine Palamite tradition as opposed to the Latin, both Thomistic and Franciscan traditions. I don't know what you have to say.
Just to get clear then, so I think as the Greeks would put it, the essence could exist without the logi cannot exist without the essence.
That's right. The Franciscans would agree with that too.
They would agree. Okay, so
absolutely,
but why is that?
Yes.
Why is that not a real distinction if one can exist without the other?
Insofar as, okay, I see what you mean then. What the Franciscans would say, not that it can exist without the other, meaning in terms of the logi, yes, God's acts of will to in create, yes, those are not necessary. God doesn't necessarily choose those, and this they would explain through, and this is where the mystery of selection comes in. And if you, it seems to me, if you reject some form of selection, it seems to move back towards an idea of necessary creation. So the Franciscans are trying to avoid any kind of necessitarian act of creation on God's part. And so, yes, insofar as they're items selected by the divine will to actually create, yes, there is no necessity in that sense. So I think I'm understanding what you're saying. But in terms of the reality that God exists without the logi, assuming that he acts, that his will earmarks certain realities to be created, that would be an asymmetrical relationship. Yes, the ideas and the logi are because of the essence, and the choice is because of the essence manifesting these truths, and God, in a sense, earmarking these truths for real creation. But then I think where the necessity would be located in the Franciscan tradition would be a broader discussion of how do you distinguish between contingency and necessity, and for Scotus especially, contingency would be demarcated by the term. So once we understand that the term is contingent, therefore we can infer that the act was contingent, even if it's difficult to explain that action of God ad intra vis-a-vis his essence. We can still know, because of the term being contingent, that this act must have been contingent and not necessitated by the essence itself. And that is a difficulty to explain. But I think, on the other hand, there are other difficulties if you don't recognize, if you separate, meaning that the logi can exist independently or be separated from the divine essence, then you say, well, how are they still divine? And I think that's where the formal distinction is trying to find a middle way of understanding distinction without separation. Because I think that's the ultimate question is, are these items are acts of God in terms of his will ad intra, are they able to exist independently and separately from his essence? And I think the Franciscan tradition would say, well, no, because God is hypostasized in all of his will acts. So they can't exist separately or independently. But nevertheless, like the issue is being raised, there certainly are contingent terms of his will.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a different sort of problem.
I mean, clearly they can't exist independently of the essence. I guess the question, though, is can't the essence exist independently of them, without creating? And wouldn't that be enough to ground a real distinction in this sense of the term? And I grant you it's asymmetric, right? It's not that they each can exist independently of the other. It's rather one can exist independently, one cannot.
Right.
So, but wouldn't that fall within the scope of a real distinction, or not? I mean, clearly not,
well,
because, right? But
I guess if the action, yeah, I suppose if the action is terminating ad intra in God, and in a sense, there's a kind of overlaying of the divine essence with respect to all of the contingent acts of will, I would see a difficulty in explaining how those contingent acts of will, as terminating again, as being God's acts, obviously with a termination ad extra, but that is distinct from God. That is creation, and so creation is finite by definition. But in terms of the will themselves, the will acts themselves, as a will act being in God, and not with respect to its termination, I would have a more difficult time seeing how those could exist, even granting asymmetry, which I'm happy to grant, how those could exist independently or separately from God himself. Because it's not as though God contingently wills to create and then he could change his mind. Or he begins to will after not willing. Somehow these contingent acts of God are also eternal with God insofar as God doesn't begin to act after not acting. That's why that's where I would go in trying to explain. I don't see how they could be separable, or these will acts of God as acts of God, or independent as acts of God from the divine essence, even if there is asymmetry. Because there's a certain asymmetry between the relations of the persons of the Trinity too. But we would say each are equally the divine essence, even if they have the divine essence as generated and as, or affiliated and as spirated. It raises similar issues in terms of that asymmetry within the divine being, while still maintaining the unity of the divine being and distinction.
Did y'all have any more? Otherwise, I do have some questions, but I really don't want to get in between y'all. Dr. Bradshaw.
That's great. Yeah, thank you, Dr. Goff. That was helpful. So
thank you. It really is a pleasure and an honor. And unfortunately, I've been barred from my local library, so I haven't been able to get some books. I wanted to brush up on some of your writings, so I'm shooting from the hip, and sometimes my memory is not as precise or adroit as I would have hoped, but it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Well,
I do have a couple follow-up questions for each of you, and then we'll get to some chat questions and wrap it up. I'm not sure how y'all are doing on time. Do y'all have just a little bit more?
Sure.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. So Dr. Goff, let me ask you two questions, then Dr. Bradshaw. So for one, we hear in Catholicism that when a person dies in God's grace, they go to heaven, so to speak. They will see the beatific vision. They will see the essence of God, not fully, but they will know God's essence in some qualified sense. How is that compatible with the essence and energies distinction, which seems to indicate that we will never know the essence of God?
Is that for Dr. Bradshaw?
That's for you, Dr. Goff.
Oh, okay. Yes, that's a good question. I think a fundamental distinction that comes from Augustine and is especially emphasized in the Franciscan tradition, and this is more easily maintained in the Franciscan tradition because of their understanding of divine infinity as a maximal positive perfection, which is radically incommensurate with any finite mind. And so they would hold the distinction between apprehension and comprehension very close. And so they would say, yes, in a sense, by virtue of the fact that God's manifesting or operating through these perfections ad extra, these what would Scotus would divide between simple perfections and simply simple, or pure perfections, which are purely spiritual perfections, because he's manifesting and acting in this way. And these pure perfections or energies, in my opinion, are not they're not formally infinite in conceptual content. They can be known. So God can manifest himself in these finite ways because he has these distinct perfections that he's able to create in terms of an act ad extra in terms of. And so, to steal some language from the East, God is hypostatic in all of his operations. There is a real identity between God and his operations insofar as his operations truly are God. And the essence is present in those operations. And so Scotus and Bonaventure would distinguish then between comprehension as knowledge of God in the full sense, as though, I have a comprehensive concept of say, a dog or a tree. That is something that is impossible for the Franciscan metaphysical tradition. And Thomas will say, for different reasons, the same thing, but I think it doesn't work out quite the same way. What the important point is, though, is that for Scotus and Bonaventure, the essence can never be known in that full sense. It can never be comprehended. And it can only be apprehended as present, but not comprehended. We'll never exhaust the essence of God. And so in this sense, it's similar to what Dr. Bradshaw was saying. And you'll find in later Franciscan figures, like the theological and theologian and mystic Maximilian Kolbe, there is a notion, a reinsertion based upon this infinity metaphysics of the notion from St. Gregory of Nyssa and St. Maximus of epiktasis, this perpetual process in processing in God, perichoretic, but also dynamic, because there always is this radical asymmetry between a creature and the capacities that a creature can ever manifest, and God himself in his infinite essential perfection. And so I think an important distinction to be realized is that when people talk about the beatific vision as seeing the essence of God, they are making in the West a distinction between apprehension as present and manifesting and comprehension. The latter is denied by all parties. And I wonder at times if this is analogous to what's being protected in the Eastern Palamite tradition and patristic tradition, where the essence of God is unknowable and unattainable. Yes, the essence of God can't be known in terms of comprehension. So it's not knowledge in the common sense of the term that we use it. Even if in the Western tradition we say we see the essence of God, we never comprehend it. It's incomprehensible. And there is now certain areas of Franciscan theology that are opening up and exploring various notions of epiktasis. Another important point, I think, is who was it? Pope Benedict XII, right after the fiasco with John the 22nd and the state of the blessed after death. And I think it's important here because what's going on, I think, in this document by Benedict XII, I think it was Benedictus Deus, where it was declared that the blessed immediately go to the beatific vision, the essence of God. But I think what's important to realize is in that text itself, it makes a distinction between what the Franciscan tradition, especially Scotus, but it's earlier in Bonaventure in his angelology, the distinction between intuitive knowledge as, in a sense, present and manifesting. There's something there, but I don't have a concept of it, versus comprehension, where what's being posited is a clear, distinct, and delimited item of knowledge. Even in that early document in the 14th century, there is this distinction in the West between intuitive knowledge of the divine essence versus comprehensive knowledge of the divine essence. And I think it's Benedict XII who says, well, yes, we see the essence of God, however, whatever that means, already presupposing distinction between intuition and abstractive knowledge. I'm sorry, I was meaning intuitive and abstractive knowledge on the one hand, and apprehensive knowledge or apprehensional knowledge and comprehensive knowledge or comprehension on the other hand. Benedict will simply say that we see God insofar as we're able to. And I don't have the quotes. I'm quoting from memory, so there could be some faults in terms of that representation. But I think it's laying out some key ideas of how we understand what it means to see God in the beatific vision. Because from my perspective, both Bonaventure and Scotus are very clear that, Bonaventure in his Disputed Questions on the Knowledge of Christ will say that the human soul of Christ will never comprehend the divine essence. There's a radical asymmetry. Even in his humanity, Christ never comprehends with his human intellect the divine essence because it's infinite. And he's given, 5 or 6 questions to argue this point. And Scotus is very stark and clear. And he says, in terms of God's radical and formal infinity, that essence is unparticipated. You cannot participate in that essence in terms of its infinity. Rather, you participate by virtue of this twofold distinction between simple and simply simple perfections as being able to be instantiated in its fullness eternally in God in an infinite mode and in creation in a finite mode. And that's a certain image or parallelism, a similitude between God and creature that allows us then to enter in through the energies of the Spirit, through the operations appropriated to the Spirit, into personal union. So this notion of participation, of taking on created perfections in a supernatural or divinizing mode, these are the dispositive causes for Scotus and Bonaventure of entering into, or being accepted, as they say, into the communion of the Trinity. And so all of these distinctions are at play, and I think what really gets people hung up on, and I haven't been able to figure it out exactly what's going on, is when St. Thomas, for example, will say that in the beatific vision, the essence of God itself becomes the species and the formal cause of our beatitude. And I don't quite understand what that means, other than it's really blowing open the created mind, because the essence of God is formally incomprehensible. So I don't see exactly how that would work metaphysically, unless you're just simply using clearly analogical language, and it becomes metaphor rather than a strictly logical, a sufficiently logical analogate between what happens in the beatific vision and what happens in creation through normal abstractive cognition. So I think that creates a lot of confusion. But for me, the essential distinctions are between intuitive, abstractive cognition, and then apprehension, comprehension. And I think, well, if we kind of drill down to what we mean, we might find we're closer to one another than we initially thought on this distinction between East and West on the question of beatitude and the nature of the beatific vision as it's discussed in the West.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that. Dr. Bradshaw, I want to ask you one and then get to chat questions. So everybody go ahead and start to put your questions in the chat. Send them to @ReasonandTheology so I can pick them out pretty easily without confusing them for a comment. Dr. Bradshaw, one final question for you. So would you say that perhaps, I'm sorry, I think I may have gotten cut out there. Are you able to hear me, Dr. Bradshaw?
I guess I missed something. I didn't hear the question if there was.
Yeah, I think I got cut out there I think on my end I got cut out. I apologize. Could you maybe explain, do you think that Palamas engaged in some form of doctrinal development when it comes to essence and energies, or do you think that he really did not develop anything? It was pretty much all there in the Cappadocians, without any development. Where do you land on that?
Yeah, I probably wouldn't call it development, but I do think there is something very important going on when someone groups together and synthesizes things that previously had been thought about in different contexts, sometimes under different terms. I think that's primarily what Palamas does, like I've described, is that he unifies under this single rubric of the divine energy or energies, could be singular or plural, really, and differently. But anyway, he unifies all these different concepts: energies of the spirit, divine attributes, divine activities, Loki, uncreated light, natural energies, and tries to make them a sort of a topic of discussion in their own right. And he doesn't do that initially, for systematic purposes. He's really not a systematic theologian. He does it because it emerges in the controversy he has with Barlaam, where he's defending the Hesychus and their vision of the uncreated light. And Barlaam had said that everything that, isn't the divine essence is a creature, essentially, that whatever this light was, is clearly not the divine essence, ousia, therefore it must be a creature. That was Barlam's position, and so Palamas was trying to respond to that, and to do so by drawing on all these earlier strands in the tradition that he then unifies in a way no one had before. Okay, and I think it's fair to say that, Maximus or the Cappadocians wouldn't have recognized some things that Palamas says, because he's saying them in his own way, in his own context, with now a kind of a synthetic outlook that they didn't have. A lot of things in the Greek tradition, are kind of addressed piecemeal, and they come up in one context, and people don't always try to relate them to other things that exist in other contexts. And there just was never that sort of systematicity that you get in scholasticism. So that's why that was something that Palamas had to do. But I wouldn't call it development in the sense of a sort of a creation of a new idea that wasn't there before. I think it was there, but it went under different names, took different forms. So anyway, that's kind of what I would do with that. It's halfway development, but not really the whole thing.
Okay. Now the first question is from email. I presume it's for Dr. Goff. Is there a real distinction between the persons of the Godhead and the natures in Christ? If so, how do those distinctions differ from the formal distinction between essence and energies?
Well, yeah, the answer to the first question is yes to both, and the reason why they differ from the formal distinction is because for the persons of the Trinity, what you are dealing with are distinct terminations of the divine essence. So the Father is infinite in act, possesses the fullness of the divine being, and through his act of generation, via the essential energies that he has, he communicates the entirety of the divine being in an infinite act to the Son. So the Son, as a termination of a perfect act of the divine being ad intra, will also then be a distinct term with a unique possession of the divine being, a different mode of possession of the divine being. And the same will hold mutatis mutandis for the person of the Trinity. The reason why they're really distinct is because they're distinct, independent subsistences of the one divine being. Now, the reason why you don't have a multiplication of entities is because the divine being is infinite. So if the divine being is communicated perfectly, then the term will possess the divine being as a distinct term without a multiplication of natures. Now, with respect to the incarnation, the hypostatic union, yes, there's a real distinction. Of course, again, only recognized through reason. And many church fathers will use the term kat opinium. And you find in St. Cyril of Alexandria saying, well, yes, this distinction is only known by reason, and it creates certain problems. Well, what kind of distinction is it? Well, simply what this means is, again, that there is an essential distinction in terms of nature between the divine nature terminating in the person of the Word and the created human nature terminating in the same person. There's a real distinction because there is a distinction of essence, thing and thing in the with respect to the natures. However, both natures, divine and human, subsist in the one divine person, and thus they have a personal unity that explains the unity of their action, agency, and attribution. And thus you can develop certain ways of speaking about both natures through either the so-called communicatio idiomatum. And so the key point here is that there is a little bit there is a qualification with the persons of the Trinity, because the persons of the Trinity are not separable or independent. And that's a big difference. And so it raises the question of how are they really distinct? Well, the tradition will say they're really distinct because they're distinct terminations of acts of communication from the Father to these other terminating in other two persons, fully communicating the divine being. And because they're perfect communications, the termination will be perfect as well. And thus each termination will possess the one divine being in its fullness as distinct termination. And so there's an order of origination. And so the classical definition of, say, Boethius is perhaps, which is a person is an individual substance of a rational nature, is perhaps amplified or or finessed by Richard of St. Victor's, an incommunicable existence of an intellectual nature. And here's the notion that is important, is a person is ultimately incommunicable and independent from other persons. The Son does not depend on the Father in terms of his essential perfection, but yet he does proceed from the Father as generated by the Father through the Father's act of affiliation. Whereas in the hypostatic union, we're not dealing with primarily or exclusively with distinct terminations of a nature. We're actually dealing with two different natures, both terminating in the one eternal divine person. So they're different ways of cashing out the real distinction, but they both are real insofar as there's an independence, and in the case of the incarnation, there's essential distinction. And so you're dealing with, in a sense, two things with reference to the natures and multiple terminations with reference to the persons in the hypostatic union and Trinity, respectively.
Dr. Bradshaw, this one is for you. How specifically would one differentiate theosis in this life from theosis in the next life, since on your view we already can experience the energies directly? Would the difference be merely in degree? Mm-hmm. I presume it's for you. It wasn't directly addressed to you.
Yeah, I think it is in degree, and I think it's, this is a pretty prevalent theme in the Greek fathers, and a lot of, if you go back to the Desert Fathers, for instance, and some of that early monastic literature, even the Life of St. Anthony by Athanasius, he, I don't know if Athanasius uses the word theosis there, but clearly that's what he's portraying in the way Antony becomes, it's interesting that Antony, you might say, he becomes divine by becoming fully human. There's a really interesting passage in the life of St. Anthony where it says that he's now, it's when he emerges from that desert fort in the desert, that abandoned fort where he lived for 20 years, wrestling with demons. And he finally emerges, and Athanasius says that he has become fully natural, meaning that he is now what human beings were made to be. And human beings were made to be divine in the sense of partakers of the divine nature, the phrase from 2 Peter. And our current state is radically unnatural. So it's largely through the ascetic life, so the fathers distinguish these three stages, practicae, the praxis of the ascetic life, then physicae, that what they call natural contemplation, and then theologia, pure prayer. But practicae, that practice of the ascetic life, is the foundation for the higher stages of sort of likeness to God. And it does begin in this life. And I think you see in the saints, how that can take amazing and mysterious forms, even in this life, all the more so in the life to come. So, I mean, degree, the only reason I don't like saying it's a difference in degree is it sounds as if we can just quantify this on some sort of a scale. I don't think we can quantify it, but I do think it's a continuous process that begins in this life and never ends. That's why there's also then perpetual progress in the life to come.
Okay. Dr. Goff, does the Scotist tradition allow God to know what happens in the world without this knowledge violating simplicity?
Right. Yes. Well, I mean, the simple answer would be, for both Bonaventure and Scotus, is that all of the divine ideas in terms of possibles are generated by virtue of the truth, of the expressive truth of the divine essence. So yes, God knows all truth because of who God is. And so insofar as he knows creation ad extra, it's not as though he knows it in terms of a process whereby his mind is informed by taking a look at creation. Rather, he knows his will acts primarily, which fully represent what is created, what are those terms of his will ad extra. And so in a sense, the simple answer would be that, yes, God knows creation by knowing his own will with respect to creation. but he doesn't know it in a formal causal way or an efficient causal way. Creation doesn't make God know, it doesn't cause God to know, nor does creation inform God's knowledge and cause it to increase or be perfected. God simply knows creation by knowing his own will with respect to the items that he wills to create.
Now, this one is for you, Dr. Bradshaw. What is Dr. Bradshaw's view on Aquinas' 5 ways? Specifically, if any, which of the 5 is the most philosophically rigorous and compelling argument, in your opinion?
Well, so they're really grounded in Aristotle, particularly the first 2 ways, but even the third and the fifth. Let's see. So make sure I'm getting the order correct. The third is based on contingency. It's the fourth that's based on degrees of perfection. The fifth is then the sort of the teleological argument. So the Greek fathers certainly do give arguments for the existence of God, but they generally don't do it on that sort of a metaphysical basis, drawing on the Aristotelian analysis of motion. What you have in the first 2 ways, and especially the first way, is sort of an adaptation of what's in Physics Book 8 that then was read and reworked and sort of finessed by Avicenna and then Maimonides before you even get to Aquinas. So Aquinas is receiving this sort of at the tail end of a long tradition of medieval Aristotelian thought that wasn't part of the Greek tradition. Okay, I mean, it's quite interesting if you look at sort of the big picture. There are a lot of ways in which you can group together Latin Christianity with Islam and Judaism, Islamic philosophy and Jewish philosophy, whereas the Greek patristic tradition sort of stands apart because it was much less influenced by Aristotle, and particularly by Aristotle's metaphysics and natural theology. That's not to say they didn't read Aristotle or didn't use Aristotelian terminology. They certainly did, but they never incorporated that Aristotelian physical argument for the existence of God. Same thing with the third way, which is again based on, even though it's not based on motion, it is based on denying an infinite causal regress. In this case, with reference to causation of contingent beings by a necessary being. That I think was first developed by Avicenna. And again, it's not one that you find, at least in that form, in the Greek tradition. So I think there's the most commonality probably with the fifth way, the argument from design. That's the kind of argument for the existence of God that is most common in the Greek tradition. But even there, I think the way Aquinas states it is largely Aristotelian, whereas the way they state it would often not be, might, if anything, resemble Stoic arguments a little bit more. Now, that's not even getting at the question, which was, well, what do I think? I don't have a settled opinion on all these arguments, but I do have a lot of, when I read Aristotle, at least in Physics Book 8, I just see countless points where it looks to me like questions are being begged, and he's kind of doing makeshift work in a way to get at a certain conclusion. And even the argument for the prime mover that's in Metaphysics Lambda, I think, is very problematic because it's based on this premise that anything that can exist or that can occur, it's called the principle of plenitude as it's applied to temporal actuality, that anything that can occur given infinite time will occur. And I actually don't think that's correct, because there are different orders of infinity, and different cardinalities is the way we would put it today, and the infinity of time, even if you suppose an infinite past, is of the lowest level of cardinality. I've never found those arguments very convincing. I also think there are problems that arise from those arguments because it's particularly, the first 2 ways then give you God as pure actus purus. And that again is a very Aristotelian concept. It's right out of Metaphysics Lambda. But it's problematic if you're going to then believe in, as Christians do, in divine freedom. And this kind of gets back to a lot of things we've been talking about all along. How do we understand that God is free to create? He doesn't have to create. And yet his will to create is eternal. Well, however we understand that, I think it's got to be in a way that recognizes there are things God could have done that he didn't do. All right. And in a straightforward sense, then, there are unrealized capacities God has to have created a different world. And I don't see how that's going to fit in with that idea of God as pure act. And this is, so this is I say it's problematic, and that's quite independently of anything coming out of the Greek tradition or palamas. It's a problem that was recognized and discussed intensely within the Thomistic tradition and probably elsewhere in Latin scholasticism. It's just a way in which I think you see that Aristotelian concept isn't really a good match, a good fit onto Christian thought about God. At least if you are going to try to import it and apply it, then there's got to be a lot of careful explanation to explain how this is compatible with divine freedom in a way that Aristotle himself never envisioned. So anyway, that's another reason why I have some hesitations about the five ways, which isn't to say that there are not good arguments for the existence of God. I think there are, but I don't think that using them to kind of construct a natural theology in the way that Aquinas does is the right way to approach that issue.
So let me ask, starting with Dr. Goff, one final question, very, very briefly here. Would you say, based upon our discussion, starting again with you, Dr. Goff, would you say, based upon our discussion today, that there perhaps are some fundamental differences between the two traditions of Scotism and Palamism, or that these differences are more, or are just less substantial?
Well, yes, I think there are some fundamental differences, especially in terms of context and development of language and concepts. However, I still remain, less than satisfied with whether or not the question of whether or not we've arrived at a consistent usage of terms across or when communicating in terms of real distinction. How do we understand real distinction versus virtual versus form? I think that does take more work, and perhaps is a semantic or analogous range of usages of real distinction within the Palamite tradition. But I'm yet, and this would require a good deal more discussion and thought on my part, perhaps with Dr. Bradshaw and working through some of these issues. I'm not yet convinced that real distinction is being used in a consistent manner. It seems as though, especially in certain forms of apologetics, a real distinction is being used in terms of exclusion. Yes, we exclude by affirming a real distinction any kind of Latin conception of divine unity and simplicity on the one hand, while on the other hand, perhaps there's a way of then mitigating that real distinction when we arrive at difficult implications that would maybe seem to say that or suggest that God is composed. And so, I don't think that is where the reality lay at a popular level. Or at kind of an apologetics or point winning level. I think there's much more fruitful discussion to be had in just how we use these notions of distinctions, Western and Eastern, when communicating with each other. And through my reading of scholarship on Gennadius Scholarius, I still think he provides a very helpful way forward. And I tend to be still and remain most sympathetic to his account of this distinction, probably because of, at least in part, biases towards the Franciscan tradition, but also biases in terms of really wanting to see reconciliation on these issues and blunt any needless polarities or exclusions that don't really get to the heart of the issue. So yes, there remain differences, especially in forms of expression. But I think we're talking about the same realities, and the human mind has a limited capacity to imagine various kinds of distinctions. And so, how many distinctions are on the table that are really able to be used consistently remains a question. And I still maintain hope that, there is, as someone once said in a book, there is a ground of union, and perhaps it still is, understanding palamas consistently in Western mindset and Western idiom through the formal distinction, and maybe that will take some amplification of how we use and apply a formal distinction in the West. I'm not opposed to that. That is possible. But my hope is, for clarity and consistency and trying to come to a common mind.
Dr. Bradshaw, so would you say that in the end there appears to be irreconcilable differences here between the two traditions? Or do you think that, no, there might be potential for common ground?
Oh yeah, there's a lot of common ground. And in terms of sort of irreconcilable differences, I would agree, as far as I understand, with the statement Dr. Goff made at the beginning, that a lot of what we're talking about was never dogmatically defined in a way that commits you as an Orthodox or as a Catholic, I've got to believe X. So I don't really see it as a church dividing issue in that sense. I think what we're facing here are different traditions of thought that did arise in different languages, different cultural contexts. The Greek tradition, itself is complex, but I think there's a sort of unity there. The Latin tradition is more diversified, so within Latin scholasticism, you get this divergence between the Franciscan and Dominican traditions. And that also has, that's a complex issue, right? So I really agree. I think Scholarios is an important figure. For what it's worth, there was a really good article, I just want to put in a plug, about Scholarios and his interpretation of the essence energies distinction that was in the journal Analogia, that's put out, it's in English, but it's published in Greece, but it's a journal of Orthodox theology. I think you can find it online. An article by George Caprive, who's a German historian of philosophy, that it's the best thing I've read yet on that topic. And I would agree with Dr. Goff. I think that's a great road forward, in a sense, is to fully analyze and recover the work that was done in the 15th century. It's not like we've got to invent the wheel over again. People at his time were already facing these same questions and trying to sort of talk about the Palamite understanding using Latin terminology, right? And so a lot can be done just in recovering that and taking that as our starting point for going forward.
Excellent. And just to clarify, Dr. Goff, earlier when we were talking about fundamental differences, would you agree with Dr. Bradshaw here, however, that they aren't church dividing or irreconcilable? Is that your position?
Yes, especially from a Catholic perspective. I'm not fully privy to the canonical status of the 14th century councils, whether or not Palamism is binding upon all Orthodox. I understand there is some dispute over that issue. But even assuming that the Palamite distinction and a maintenance of an articulation, theologically speaking and philosophically speaking, of that distinction, again, I don't think that's opposed intrinsically to the Catholic tradition, A, because there is no dogmatic definition of the explanation of what we mean by pure act or simplicity, and then B, the coexistence of multiple explanations, multiple schools trying to explain how we understand divine simplicity and how we understand God's perfections and his actions, both ad intra and ad extra. So I think even granting the strongest dogmatic status of Palamism in the East, I still don't think it's a church dividing issue, because the West, in a sense, or in essence, has no dogmatic position on the topic.
Good.
So well, I really appreciate what Dr. Bradshaw was saying.
Indeed. Well, I want to give both of you an opportunity to put in a plug for anything you're working on. Dr. Bradshaw, is there anything that you want to plug at this moment?
Oh my gosh.
You're working on a website?
Well, let's see. So I've been dabbling in other topics that are probably way over my head. But there's been a lot of controversy lately about universalism, and so-called patristic universalism and people like Origen and Gregor of Nyssa. So I have an article that I just posted on Academia. If you want to look at it, it's called Patristic Views on Why There Is No Repentance After Death.
Excellent.
And I'm sure it will probably make me some enemies out there, but I've been trying to understand that whole issue of the afterlife. And, it's a hard question. Why is there no repentance? But I think that the fathers do have an answer for that I try to draw out in that article. And working on other things too. I've also written. Oh, I'll tell you what's really going to make me some enemies. I'm working on one that's about what does it mean for an act to be contrary to nature. Which is a term you used to hear an awful lot, and I think you don't hear it as much anymore because it's sort of, it's just pushes a lot of buttons for people. But it's an important term and concept for Christian theology, for Christian ethics, and I think we do need to understand it rightly. So I'm working on that, and one of these days there'll be something probably on the web about that as well. So.
The first one is especially intriguing. So I presume you're dealing with apokatastases explicitly.
I'm sorry. Say that again.
In the first article, are you dealing with apokatastases?
Oh well, I try to focus just on that question of repentance after death. But yeah, of course, that has a lot of implications.
Right.
I mean, the thing that leaps out to me when I read Gregory of Nyssa is that he recognizes that the apokatastasis that he envisions doesn't begin with repentance. It doesn't begin by the condemned in the afterlife eventually sort of realizing, oh, I was wrong, and then seeking to repent before God. It begins with a kind of a forcible purification. He uses the analogy of a rope that's caked over with mud, and how you could draw that rope through a little narrow hole and scrape the mud off. And he says that's sort of what God will do to those souls. And it's a way of thinking about salvation that I really, frankly, I don't think is biblical. I think it's more coming out of the Platonic tradition. And I think that's why it was never accepted more broadly. It's kind of a philosophical, speculation on his part, but it's really not adequate to the biblical understanding of salvation.
If you're available sometime, I'd love to have you on and we could talk about that further. I'm going to read your article first, though.
Okay.
But thank you so much for coming on. Dr. Goff, go ahead and put in a plug for anything you're working on.
Well, staying busy. I'm working, still engaged in a big works project for 20th century conventual Franciscan Peter Damian Fellner. It's grown to now an anticipated 10 volumes. So I'm working away at that. Hope to get the first 2 volumes done and submitted for publication within the next couple of months, hopefully mid-June to mid. Currently working on some translation projects. Translating Bonaventure's treatise on the theological virtues from book 3 of his sentence commentaries. Which was a big project, and we're all done with the translation now. It's just sort of editing and writing an introduction. So that's been keeping me busy. And then reading and trying to figure out certain developments in the West in terms of economy and social structure, which kind of relates to what is a natural action and what is contra naturam, as they say. That topic is cropping up in some of my research in the Franciscan tradition. So continually working and dabbling in different areas there, but mostly right now just the big editing project and this translation, trying to get these 2 things off of my desk.
I hear you. Well, excellent. Thank you, gentlemen, for both coming on and taking time out of your busy schedule to engage in this topic. This was extremely fruitful, in my opinion. So once again, I want to thank you both for coming on.
Yeah. Well, thank you for having us. And Dr. Goff, a pleasure to meet you virtually, as it were. And I think this was really fruitful, too.
Thank you very much. I feel the same.
Everyone, thank you for watching. Please comment, like, subscribe if you haven't already. Until next time, God bless you all.